Good evening. I am Barbara Johnson. I am the current president of the Breezy Point Historical Society of New York, and welcome to our 2023 Hall of Fame Banquet Induction Ceremony. Thank you all for being here tonight. This year we are honoring two very deserving recipients, the Rockaway Point Joint Action Committee and Tom Hennessy. I am now standing just off Bedford Avenue near the commercial area where an existing memorial dedicated to the Rockaway Point Joint Action Committee is located. In 1960, the residents of Breezy Point were in imminent danger of losing their homes and their way of life. The owner of the property at the time, William Austin, had sold the property out from under the community to a developer, and their homes were destined to be demolished. Thankfully, a group of men and women known as the Rockaway Point Joint Action Committee was formed, and with their efforts and the help and support of many others, were able to buy back our property, and that is why we are still here today. Tonight you will learn more about their story. And now, please join me as we travel back to 1960 to learn more about the most consequential year in Breezy Point's history.
Today we're going to honor the Joint Action Committee as the newest member of the Breezy Point Historical Society's Hall of Fame. The Joint Action Committee played a major role in the formation of this corporation. 1960 started for the people that lived in Breezy Point like most other years. Many were still probably thinking about things that they had done over the summer, or were dreaming about taking the shutters off of their house to start a new summer down here. The community was virtually all summer residents at that time, although there were some people that were living here year-round.
For the perspective of 1960, looking back, Breezy Point, which was really Breezy Point, Rockaway Point, and Roxbury, had a half a century of pretty much living a way of life that people loved. It was a summer colony, 3 summer colonies, where people came down from their respective winter homes, and they spent the summer on the beach. There was the ocean, there was the bay, there were ferries. This was a way of life people absolutely loved. It was very much the way they intended to spend, many of them, the rest of their lives.
A great summer had taken place, and prospects were that another great summer was before everyone. At that time, there was no unified Breezy Point. There were 3 separate communities, each of which had their own homeowners associations.
Now, there were differences. There were actually 3 different communities before 1960. Yeah, there was one landlord, the Rockaway Point Development Company. But the 3 communities were actually very different. They enjoyed a similar lifestyle. But you had Roxbury, Rockaway Point, and Point Breeze. Each one had their own association. Each association had its own bylaws. The bylaws were enforced by their own bar captains. So the summer of 1959, Labor Day came around, people went home. People trudged back to the winter homes, assuming 1960 is going to be more of the same. There was a dramatic change coming that people down here had to react to. Now, for the prior half century, it was a very stable relationship between the tenants in the 3 different associations and the landlord. It was a very harmonious relationship. We paid rent. They pretty much stayed out of our affairs. Everything was smooth. In 1960, that changed dramatically. The Rockaway Point Development Company, the landlord, almost secretly was planning on selling the property out from under us. And you have to bear in mind how much people had invested in this property already. They were going to be evicted. So that's why we're here tonight, to look at the process, how we escaped that, how we managed to grab victory from the jaws of defeat, because defeat was imminent. In a period of only a couple of months, we would have lost everything. So tonight we're talking about how we avoided that, and it really comes down to not only the way the three different communities pulled together, and there were three different communities, but how the leadership pretty much merged them into a common enterprise. And then that leadership became the nucleus of the Breezy Point Cooperative. So now let's go back to early 1960. Where does it all begin? Walter Winchell, a famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, newspaper columnist, some people refer to him as a gossip columnist, mentioned a rumor in one of his articles about the largest real estate deal in New York City history, the sale of the west end of the Rockaway Peninsula. This was imminent. This was soon picked up by other papers, of course. Much less publicly, during early February of 1960, an ominous notice of meeting went out to the stockholders of the Rockaway Point Development Company, the landlord, proposing the liquidation of the company and the sale of its assets. We were the major asset. The landlord's principal, William Austin Jr., soon after gave formal notice that on March 4th, 1960, the stockholders approved the sale and a contract was entered. So at this point, legally speaking, there was a contract to sell the entire property from the Marine Parkway Bridge all the way out to the jetty, with the exception of Fort Tilden. This was a huge deal. We were in the way of that. So anyway, the contract was signed. Curiously, the name of the buyer kept changing, but that's something we'll have to research. So anyway, why was this property being sold? What was the value of a giant sandbar with summer bungalows to a buyer? The word eventually got out that the developer had a dream city, a, quote, city within a city, which he was planning on. Although whether that dream would ever actually be actualized, well, we can't tell today. The buyer publicized his plans to construct enough 22-story buildings to house 220,000 new residents, 40 religious buildings, 21 schools, 12 parks, police stations, firehouses, libraries, other facilities on 635 acres. You cobble all that together, it was probably less than a mile square. Think about that. Think about the sheer density, the sheer infrastructure being involved here in this development. The shock to our residents, who, like today, owned their homes but not their land, was dramatic. Many had invested their life savings in the bungalows. Many had deep family connections to the summer communities. Some even lived here year-round. They had nowhere else to go. It was reported that, except for Fort Tilden, this entire part of the peninsula was going to be sold.
Sometime in the spring of 1960, a meeting is held at the old Rockaway Point Fire Department house. The firehouse could only fit so many people, and the firehouse soon became overloaded and people had to gather outside. And at that firehouse, there was a proposal sent out by Al Greeley to announce what they were going to call the Joint Action Committee.
On May 10th, Point Breeze Association committed its support for the Joint Action Committee. Meanwhile, Joe Sten, as chairman of the People's Association of Roxbury, added Roxbury's approval. The further goal of the Joint Action Committee, acting to purchase the property, was made explicit. Now, all three communities were on board, and the Rockaway Point Joint Action Committee was formed. In the first order of business, create an organization, then start raising money. A preliminary executive committee was formed that included 3 lawyers, 2 bankers, 2 accountants, 3 high-ranking executives from the business world, 2 well-known educators, along with the presidents and other officers from the 3 associations. The new organization would be chaired by John P. Hale. The publicity committee was co-chaired by Francis Gleason and Gus Guida. A telephone exchange manned in the evenings, but otherwise accepting voicemails, was set up. Alexander Greeley became the chair of the Legal and Professional Committee, which already had 14 volunteer lawyers lined up to help out. Frank Cannon was chair of the Political Committee. A massive letter-writing campaign by residents to political leaders had already been ongoing. A more massive one was now planned. Within 2 months of the landlord's approval of the sale, $10,000 was raised and spent on the growing preservation campaign. Bumper stickers had been ordered which were intended to display throughout the city that, quote, "This is the fightingest group of neighbors in the country," close quote, as reported in a local newspaper. And while the rest of the country can't be accounted for, the residents of this tiny sandy patch at the out-of-the-way western end of the Rockaway Peninsula soon earned their reputation for fighting back. So who are these people on the Joint Action Committee? What do we know about them 6 decades later? Our board member, Leslie Barnett. Leslie Barnett is Ruth Clark's daughter. Ruth Clark was fundamentally important for the Joint Action Committee and later for the cooperative.
John Hale was an amazing person. My mother told me she was probably the smartest man she ever knew. He would sit at the meeting, he was the chair, and he'd listen to each person what they said. Just listen, nod, and at the end, he would then exclaim and put the whole thing together and made sense of it. He was just so super organized and had such an orderly mind that he was amazing.
Dan Scannell is the vice chair of the Joint Action Committee. In his earlier life, Scannell was a transit cop. His career enjoyed a meteoric rise after he received a law degree. He ended up being the acting president of the Metropolitan Transit Authority, quite a plum in those days, and an acknowledged expert on New York transportation matters. He also argued 4 cases before the United States Supreme Court. For years after his service of the Joint Action Committee, he served in a behind-the-scenes advisory capacity for the co-op. William Albright was the treasurer of the Joint Action Committee. Raising and spending funds were to be critically important roles as the spring and the summer campaigns picked up steam. His daughter, Barbara Ferdern, recounts how he spent hours tracking payments from the tenants necessary for the purchase of the property. The 3 associations were well represented at the Joint Action Committee. Ed Wengler was president of the Rockaway Point Association, which he quickly summoned to a special meeting during March 1960 as soon as word of the sale leaked out. Wengler was the moving force behind the unified front that our 3 communities was able to bring. Rockaway Point Association Secretary Frank Fleeson also joined the Joint Action Committee. Marta Moran galvanized the Point Breeze Association into action as soon as the invitation to join the Rockaway Point Association arrived. We have copies in our archives of the letters he quickly dispatched to the Point Breeze Association's summer residents during March. Joe Sten, who is prominent in Roxbury history, rallied Roxbury as president of the Roxbury People's Association. We enrolled Joe Sten in the Breezy Point Historical Society's Hall of Fame in 2018, recognizing his role in co-op history, but also his service as the first general manager of the Breezy Point Cooperative. Joe Kearns was a successful businessman. In fact, she recalled he covered a lot of the early expenses of the Joint Action Committee out of his own pocket, out of personal funds. He knew how to raise money, and he knew how to handle money, according to Leslie. Critical skill for when you're starting off is basically just a neighborhood preservation organization. Alex Greeley, a gregarious extrovert who worked very well with people, a great skill for a lawyer dealing with politicians during negotiations.
Edward Barnett, my father-in-law, he lived on Tioga Walk. He was a businessman, a solid businessman. He owned a printing business. He did business with the Port Authority, a lot of big places. He was very business-minded. So he on the committee, everybody had a strong point. But he was, as I say, he was a pure businessman. He wanted to know the why, the what, and how are we going to pay for it.
Leslie described Howard Noonan as a very serious businessman who, like John Hale, could very ably sum up the outcome of each of the many meetings that took place over the spring and summer months of 1960. And of course, there was Ruth Clark, Leslie's mother, who was so instrumental on the Joint Action Committee and later on the co-op. Skills that she transferred over to the new governing organization. and who became Breezy Point's first real historian. The Breezy Point Historical Society really owes quite a lot to her, because we've built on the record that she compiled back in the early 1960s of what transpired before the co-op and during the early years of the co-op. She was also the first recipient of our Hall of Fame award in 2017. We'd also like to recognize other members of the Joint Action Committee, each of whom provided valuable contributions to the effort during the spring and summer of 1960. These include Vincent Fetch, Thomas Fitzgerald, Thomas Power, Edward Robinson, Thomas Senningen, Kenneth Thornhill, and Charles Waters.
The Joint Action Committee created something they called Aloha. Obviously, Aloha to signify the beach and the rest. Aloha technically meant the Alliance of Organized Homeowning Associates. Most people, however, growing up back then, remember it to mean Austin, leave our homes alone. So when people said Aloha, it was kind of a shot at the person who was selling the property. One of the things that Aloha did was to attempt to raise money outside of the money that would have to come out of the pockets of the shareholders to help pay for the legal fees, to help pay ultimately for the purchase of the land. Bumper stickers were sold. The bumper stickers said Aloha. So one, they're raising funds. Two, they're sending a message out as each person in the community drives the roads between the community and their areas where they lived. Aloha was everywhere. It became part of the whole fabric of this community. Ultimately, around June and July of 1960, meetings were held directly between the Joint Action Committee on behalf of all three homeowners associations and on behalf of all of the owners in the Breezy Point Cooperative with the people that were purchasing the land. They were no longer dealing with Austin, they were dealing with the purchasers of the land, and they essentially wanted to get a portion of the land. And some point in the summer, in June, July of 1960, it was agreed that the land which now forms the Breezy Point Cooperative, Roxbury, Rockaway Point, and Breezy Point together with the divide between those two lands, was going to be purchased directly by the people that lived on the land. One of the things that's often lost is that some of the land, that not all of the shareholders that lived down here, or not all of the people that had homes down here, actually had their land bought. And ultimately they had to be given options as to whether they would move their homes into the community or whether their homes would be sold off, because that was the only choice. That was the only feasible way that negotiations could be held that would ultimately put this down. So now the Joint Action Committee, on behalf of all of the people that live down here and on behalf of the associations, reaches this tentative deal for about $12 million to actually buy the land. A vote had to be taken that the land deal that had been put into place by the Joint Action Committee would be accepted by the purchasers in this community. And in the first week or so of November in 1960, votes were held amongst the associations by the people that would eventually become shareholders, and they did in fact ratify the fact that the land down here would be bought, that they consented to the purchase of the land, that they consented to pay the down payment money, and that they ultimately consented to accept a mortgage on their property so that they could buy their land.
That's when the Joint Action Committee asked for 300 volunteers. They called them minutemen. The minutemen, at first it was kind of clerical work, answering phones, writing letters, that sort of thing. But the Minutemen eventually took on a much more dramatic role in rounding up support for the proposal. The role of the Minutemen was to keep people involved. They would go door to door. They would explain what the proposal was. They would explain the financing. They would explain, well, there's going to be a $500 down payment everybody has to pay. They would explain how that was going to be handled. They would explain how the money was going to be held in escrow. It would be trustworthy to provide this $500. So the Minutemen actually were they were the forces on the ground.
I was a 20-year-old young man at that time and volunteered for one aspect of the process, which was the so-called minutemen moment, all of which required that each and every member of the community, each homeowner, be approached for what I might call put your money where your mouth is. It came to be that Labor Day weekend, 1960, was extremely important, and what came to be known as the Minutemen Group, which were just volunteers from every street, everywhere in the three communities, maybe 200 folks, were identified, agreed to help, and very quickly, I'm talking hours now, were given certain documents, which I'll touch on, to go see perhaps 10 or 15 homeowners, and the locations were, so many numbers on Bedford Avenue. I had a list, I had the names. Most importantly, I had a document prepared by the finance department that described the need to hand into an escrow $500, sometimes called the earnest money. And then finally, I would say the point was so fortunate to gather that group together. They were just wonderful folks. Each had a different discipline, from understanding and working in Wall Street. And I like to say it all worked out.
One of the most incredible things that I think people have to recall is that while all this was going on in the summer of 1960, or said another way, just when you think nothing else could go wrong, your property is being taken away from you, your homes and your neighbors are going to be dispossessed. In 1960, one of the worst storms that ever hit the Breezy Point Cooperative hit, Hurricane Donna, where the ocean and the bay actually met each other. It's only one of two times in the history of this community that the ocean and the bay actually met. And think about these people now being asked to put up $500 each to co-sign or to be engaged in buying a mortgage on property, which is going to extend them very far, to become part of something, taking over ownership interest together. And while they're doing this, a storm hits where the landmass becomes underneath the ocean and the bay for a few hours. It didn't stop them. It didn't slow down the process. People cleaned up and continued to pursue their dream of buying the land in the cooperative. In 1960, according to the notes that I've read about the history, it wasn't that easy to incorporate a multi-shareholder corporation like this amongst the potential 2,500 or so families that were going to ultimately form what became the Breezy Point Cooperative. So what did they do? They looked around for different laws and found out that the cooperative law of the state of New York was the only mechanism that they could put into place in time so that a corporation could be formed that could take the money for the down payment and also could go to a bank or a lending institution to borrow the money to pay for the rest of the land. That is why to this day the Breezy Point Cooperative is a cooperative. On November 19th, 1960, the corporation that is the Breezy Point Cooperative officially became incorporated in the state of New York. That incorporation was done by the Joint Action Committee working through the shareholders of this community. The Williamsburg Savings Bank leased space to the cooperative that they could use their offices between Christmas and New Year's in 1961. The Joint Action Committee organized the shareholders. They did it by block, and every single day from the beginning of the morning to the evening, 400 shareholders a day came into the Williamsburg Savings Bank and signed their new leases with the Breezy Point Cooperative. The documents from the time say that the elevators were working day and night from the beginning of the morning to late at night as lines formed. People came in, signatures got signed. By January 1st, when the process was done, 2,500 signatures had been completed. the bank had its assurances that people were all in, that people did want to stay here. People had signed leases to stay here. Down payment money had been raised. And then in January of 1961, ultimately the property was closed. A mortgage was taken out on the property, and the Joint Action Committee had completed one of the most really incredible tasks of taking something from nothing and turning it into one of the largest land acquisitions in the history of the city of New York.
So in January 1961, as the deal closed for the purchase of 400 acres carved out from the original proposed development, a new real estate venture was created, the Breezy Point Cooperative. Members of the Joint Action Committee, many of them became board members or executive employees of the new co-op, had used their collective skills, their experience, and their imagination to create this unique community and what we think of today as a gift from heaven. But it was no gift. It took skills, dedication, and constant attention to detail. Over the decades, we've created our own small town within the largest city in the country. It's taken the faith, work, and skills of countless people, now over several generations, to keep it going. But the nucleus was a relatively small group of people who engineered this minor miracle in the face of imminent disaster over a few short, frantic months during 1960. The Joint Action Committee gave new life to a community that was basically going to be condemned. It gave renewed life to the few thousand residents we had down here. And as a result of that, they became the nucleus of what we have today, the current community. So for that, the Breezy Point Historical Society deservedly honors them with the Hall of Fame Award in 2023.